The President of the United States on the move today, starting his morning at Camp David, where he received the news. Let's go to David Gregory at the White House for an update on his status. David?
Brian, the president has returned to the White House. The Marine is posted outside of the West Wing, indicating the president is indeed in the West Wing, inside the Oval Office. His senior team has been assembled here now for hours. The president, a couple of hours ago, speaking to the head man at NASA as he, his chief of staff, his secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, monitor all of the information that comes not only from the ground, from the debris field in Texas and surrounding areas, but also from NASA directly. The flag here, to give you a sense of the somber atmospherics at the People's House at the White House. The flag here above the White House lowered to half staff. It happened about 45 minutes ago. A somber reminder, while there are not all the facts known here, this is indeed a very, very dark day for the country and, of course, for many parts of the world, as you were just talking to Tom Aspel in Israel as well. The president, we are told, does intend to speak to the nation at some point today. We don't know when. That's because the White House has not made that determination. First, they want more information to come to the public from NASA, some conclusions drawn about what has happened here as this disaster unfolds. But the president and Mrs. Bush returning from Camp David, where they were spending the weekend, I'm told, Brian, from people in that motorcade, in that what they call the travel pool, that it was indeed a very high-speed drive from the Maryland mountains back here to the White House.
David, I'm sorry, we were having some communications here. Can you speak for a moment, if you could, about this president who you cover for a living and see every day? It falls to him now, once again, to be in a position to calm and comfort the United States. Again, thank goodness we are not talking about a national emergency, but we are indeed talking about an apparent national tragedy today.
Certainly that, and the president will want to reflect the grief that the country is just now beginning to feel as we wait for more information. But you spoke about this a while ago, Brian, and that is that first on people's minds was the question about whether this might have any relationship to terrorism. Could there be foul play involved? Administration officials saying within the past couple of hours, yes, they're investigating that fully. The National Security Team here in place at the White House investigating that. But thus far, they have no information to conclude that this is anything other than an accident. And it's important to point that out as a search for clues and information continues here. But the president and the federal government has an intensely important role to play here to communicate what is a huge disaster in the making, impacting a huge government program, an expensive program, a high-profile program, and has been for many years in this country. The president will want to address that. There's a very large public safety concern. You've been talking about it throughout the morning, a debris field that extends beyond the portion of Texas that we've been alluding to, but may go into Oklahoma. They've talked, the Homeland Security Department has, to officials in New Mexico and Arizona, and to Louisiana as well. People need to stay away from that debris field, officials have said. So there is a very large job to be done on the ground, while at another level, the president continues to get information, he and his staff talking to officials in NASA, preparing to brief the country as the president prepares to reflect the grief that is just starting to build in the country. Brian.
And David, again, back in '86, when this was the Challenger we were talking about, national security was hardly the first thought on a lot of minds. We weren't thinking Pentagon, White House. There wasn't a Homeland Security Department, of course, but the tenor and backdrop of the nation has changed all of that.
It has. It's changed completely, and that's why one of the first questions that they addressed was whether this could be a terrorist attack. And again, they say there's no information to lead them to believe that this is anything other than an accident, and they wanted to put that to rest quickly. They also point out that an investigation of that potential leak continues and is just beginning now. This is also the first time since the Homeland Security Department has just been created by the federal government that you have an apparatus in place to coordinate information very, very quickly when something like this happened that involves not only a federal response, but a local and a state response. And we're seeing that come into play now. The Homeland Security Secretary, Tom Ridge, got one of the first phone calls, we're told from administration sources, from NASA once Columbia had fallen off their communication grid. They can no longer speak to Colombia. They immediately called Homeland Security. Calls went out then to the states that might be affected with a debris field. Calls went on to the senior staff and to the president himself. So there is a function within the federal government to coordinate agencies' response, like the Coast Guard for any search and recovery, any military assets that would be brought to bear, FEMA, responsible for emergency management in this particular case, to coordinate response on the ground in case there are any injuries or destruction there, and any intelligence information that may come into play as well. So we're seeing for the first time the speed of that response is captured and coordinated by this new Homeland Security Department.
David Gregory on the North Lawn of the White House. Again, the president has returned by SUV motorcade instead of helicopter today because the weather here on the East Coast started closing in on the Washington area yesterday. A mixture of rain and snow, and up in Maryland's Catoctin Mountains, where Camp David is located, it is usually snow if given the choice, especially with the severity of this winter. So the president had to meet with Tony Blair yesterday in the White House, traveled to Camp David anyway, but no helicopters for the president today, coming back by motorcade on surface streets. We should review what brings us here at 12:49 Eastern Time here on a Saturday afternoon. We are awaiting a NASA news conference by Sean O'Keefe, the administrator of NASA, as you look at a live picture from Mission Control. A very sad, somber, and nervous place today. They have lost a spacecraft. For the first time since 1986, a business which, by the way, has odds of safe operation, as you heard our own Jay Barbary say, a chance of about 1 in every 75 flights going down. It is, make no mistake, a dangerous business, however blasé we may get about covering it, about staying up on who is in space, for how long, and when the next flight is. As we speak here today, there is, of course, a manned orbiting International Space Station above the planet Earth. Unthinkable just about 2 decades ago. But this is what we are gathered to talk about today. Home video of what so many people across a huge part of the state of Texas saw earlier this morning. They heard a boom. Many of them rushed out of their homes. One man we spoke to thought it was an accident in a nearby rail yard. Many people have said they thought it was a sonic boom of some sort. People looked up, not quite knowing what this was at first. It resembled a vapor trail from a commercial airliner. It looked like a meteor in the bright, clear daylight of central Texas. And then when word started to spread that the Shuttle Columbia had been on its way back to Earth, we realized the truth. It stayed together, intact, as a solid but flaming piece of wreckage, as you see, only breaking up into multiple pieces as it neared the end of its trajectory. We have reason to believe that human body parts have been found. We have reason to believe the debris field here is vast and extensive, going on perhaps over several hundred miles. We have been warned all throughout this day by officials in a position to know that people should not go anywhere near these pieces of debris, and some of the larger pieces are being photographed. These pictures have been fed back to us by our NBC station in the Dallas area. This was found, as you see, on a highway median strip, one of, we've been led to believe, the larger pieces to have survived the flaming re-entry. NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell joins me, as he has all morning, here in our New York studios. Bob, what can you add to the coverage so far of this?
Well, Brian, we're waiting, of course, for the NASA news conference, which might give us our first hints of what went wrong. And I think as we prepare for that, it's not a bad idea to think about what happens when the space shuttle routinely comes back to Earth from orbit. It's orbiting high in space. They fire some rockets. It's called a burn. that slow it down enough so that it starts to fall into the atmosphere. When it hits the atmosphere, like all space vehicles do, enormous amounts of heat build up on the shield. Now, the space shuttle has a series of tiles on it to protect against that heat. In the past, there's been trouble with those tiles falling off. And there's always been the fear that if tiles did fall off, if sufficient tiles fall off, it could lead to a catastrophic accident because the heat could burn through into the space capsule. Again, we don't know that that's what happened today. That's one of the things that's been talked about, though, as a potential problem on re-entry in the past. As the shuttle heads for the landing strip, we talk about it as an airplane, but it's not an airplane in the sense that it has engines. The engines that lifted it into space stop firing altogether, and the space shuttle becomes a glider. Even though it's traveling at 12,000 miles an hour and slowing down very quickly as it heads for the Kennedy Space Center landing strip, it has no power to make it go anyplace. It just goes slower and slower. It does, however, have auxiliary power units on board, which are engines that raise the elevons, move the rudder so that it can be steered, so that it can head for the airstrip that it's where it's intended to go. There are emergency plans on landing, but the emergency plans all have to do with something happening to make the space shuttle not head for the right runway, because it's a glider. It's got to come down. It can't go back up again. So there are several other emergency sites. Airports in the area are always alerted that the shuttle might have to land there if something goes wrong. Nothing like this, of course, is anticipated because this was a catastrophic failure. It looks like, and we were only speculating, it looks like some kind of explosion. It could have been an explosion of rocket fuel on board. It could have been a structural failure. It's always the sort of things that we consider when we see a terrible air crash. There's always this long list of things: structural failure, mechanical failure that causes the fuel to explode. All those things are possibilities. The people at Mission Control, within seconds of realizing that they had lost the data from the Space Shuttle Columbia as was coming in, were told to preserve the data, to make sure that nothing got lost. That was the first steps that they took, so that it all can be reanalyzed very quickly. Now, it could be, as we've pointed out this morning, and as Jay Barbary has been pointing out from Cape Canaveral, that it could be that somebody looking at a piece of data saw right away that something went wrong immediately and has a clue. It could be that everything was destroyed very quickly. So we won't know how long the investigation will unfold, but there's an enormous amount of information that's already on the ground at Mission Control in Houston that's called telemetry. Enormous amounts of information that flows down from the Space Shuttle Columbia as it heads toward the Earth. So we could get a clue very soon today as to what went wrong. It could take a while. It will certainly take a thorough investigation. The investigation in this matter will be extraordinarily detailed, of course, because this is the kind of a catastrophic failure that will bring the Space Shuttle program to a halt until it's completely understood. And there will be many potential sets of clues. Brian?
Bob, we're, again, for viewers just joining us, we're inside 5 minutes now until what we are told will be a press statement and not a news conference, and understandably so, because of what Bob Bazell just mentioned. This will be a meticulous process, a detailed, painstaking process of figuring out what has gone wrong here today, even though, as we have discussed with Jay Barbary and others, the possibility exists that while we are having this conversation, there is someone, person or persons, at Mission Control who have a pretty good idea what went wrong here, because the shuttle is sending back real-time telemetry, real-time black box information live to screens at every stage of flight. Even those who saw the Hollywood depiction of Apollo 13 know that they had a pretty good idea on the ground, at least what area in the spacecraft had suffered a terrible failure. It was not until they actually were able to eyeball the tanks in question that they knew what had gone wrong. This is something different. The amount of science on board the Space Shuttle Columbia, even though the oldest in the fleet, it had been steadily retrofitted as part of a NASA program to keep modernizing the spacecraft. The amount of science on board this spacecraft is absolutely staggering. And as our own Jay Barbary put it, it may be one of man's most spectacular achievements. It may be the most impressive thing ever put together by human hands. It has a spectacular history of 113 flights. Just this one spacecraft alone was on its 28th mission in 22 years. And I'm just being told I can bring Jay Barbary, our veteran correspondent, into this conversation. Jay, you go back to the Mercury days when to look at what we used then and the propulsion we used to get that tiny capsule off the ground after the astronauts won the debate, after all, to put a window and a hatch in it. It is hard to believe that we're talking about this much thrust and this large a spacecraft, however now outdated this may seem by today's standards.
Yes, it is. It is getting outdated, Brian. And as you say, we go back. It started with NBC in July 1958. That'll be 45 years this July. And started covering here in the early missile launches and into when NASA was formed in August of 1958 and into the Mercury program and the 7 original astronauts. And astronaut Alan Shepard was the first to go up on May 5th, 1961 for 115 miles in space, and he was only up there 16 minutes. But and it was a suborbital flight. It was only 4,000 miles per hour, but it was a real gutsy thing for him to do, and everybody around here hit their knees in the churches and everywhere else when he flew, and the traffic stopped on the roadways and all. The place was just frozen in time when that little Mercury capsule went up there. And now here we're flying this enormous shuttles out of here rather routinely. As you said, this was the flight number 113 of shuttles. We've had 144 manned flights. We had 31 before the first shuttle flew on April the 12th, 1981, which was Columbia. And as you also reported, this was the 28th flight of Columbia. So it's a huge difference over, well, let's see, the first flight was 60, this is 2003, so come this May, it'll be 43 years.
Jay, it is hard to believe that we have been at this for this long. Of course, the technology, as you pointed out earlier, the constant retrofitting and updating continues, and I think it's safe to say that Columbia had the the best minds putting the best science inside that fuselage, certainly inside the cockpit for these astronauts to use. While we talk here, I should say, let's show what's going on. I think NASA television has a slide on the screen that will come down when they are ready to read their press statement through Administrator Sean O'Keefe. I'm wondering what picture they are giving us. I just want to make sure we get it from the very, very top the minute they are ready to read the statement. NASA has its own, called NASA Select, its own television network. In effect, it's more of a feed service given to us in the news media. It has gotten dramatically more sophisticated since the days of those first flights. It now offers spectacular camera angles, tiny cameras mounted on the launch hardware, aircraft-to-aircraft cameras, unbelievable angles of the space flight that were unimaginable just a few years ago. Just to advance what we're going to hear, Sean O'Keefe is the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the agency which has today, apparently with the rest of us, suffered a huge loss. 7 shuttle astronauts on board, including the first ever Israeli flying today when this happened over central Texas. A catastrophe in the sky. A lot of people were forced outdoors by the sound. They watched this sight play out. At first, one sizable chunk of wreckage, and then it fell apart into what we now know are some very, very tiny pieces strewn across a huge part of the Texas landscape. People being warned to stay away if and when they see it. People being warned that it not only is evidence, but may be very, very hazardous to their health because of chemicals that adhere to it. It may emit a component of the fuel used on board the Challenger, which can be harmful just on initial contact. We should show you what NASA is showing us. STS-107 was the name of this mission, and there you have it. That's what we're getting from them. This graphic will come down and be replaced by a live image of what we presume to be a podium. Administrator O'Keefe will come out and read a statement. We have yet to have a declaration of death, of course, by NASA for these 7 souls on board the spacecraft today. It's a distinction that'll certainly be important to the families, but all of our experts, Jay Barbary among them, several veteran astronauts are confirming that it is just beyond mathematically impossible for anyone to survive such a catastrophic breakup at such a speed. We're talking about something that happened 39 miles above the Earth. Space begins at roughly 60 miles, so basically double that. This spacecraft was going 12,000 miles an hour. As you look at the members of this crew, all of them astounding resumes, biographical information, so many of them veterans of more than one shuttle flight. The point we made earlier in our coverage, Edie, is just part of the makeup, the DNA of astronauts, those who push the edge of the envelope, the phrase made popular by author Tom Wolfe, that there will be another crew in line for the next mission who won't think twice about the safety of going up. It is what they do. It's what they do for a living. They are a brave, patriotic, and almost universally very smart bunch. Jay Barbary, we were making the point earlier on that they are, when you walk into a room, they are identifiable. You can pick out the astronaut. There is something about them, and they are constant dinner speakers and event speakers around this country for good reason. They have astounding stories to tell, and they're almost intoxicating to be around.
That is true, Brian. They are a cut above most people, as you said, and they really stand out. It's hard not to notice an astronaut when they walk in the room. You don't have to be told, as you said, that they are an astronaut. You know when those people walk in the room, there is something outstanding about this person. There's something extraordinary about this person, and that goes for every one of them that goes up there. And you know the commander now on the next mission is to be Eileen Collins. She was the first woman to command a mission, and she is to command the mission to the International Space Station. It was scheduled to take off on March the 1st to head to the space station, but I think that we can say that won't take place at this time. How long it'll be, we don't know. How long the shuttles will be grounded, we don't know. Until they get a firm handle on what happened today, and they have fixed it, and they feel that the shuttle is precisely safe to fly again, that's when they will fly them. How long they will leave the 3 people on board the International Space Station is another outstanding question. Will they stay up there a full year and a half? They could do it with the supplies. They've done it. We've had people stay over a year on the Mir space station. So they could stay up there, and they have their escape vehicle up there, the Soyuz, so that they can leave in case of an emergency any time. But all of these questions have to be answered depending on what happened that caused this catastrophe this morning.
Jay, when we talk about the data coming in, real-time data streaming in from this spacecraft, is it more than they were able to know during Challenger? Are there more screens that are up and running? Are there more sensors telling them the shape of more telemetry in general?
Yeah, possibly some more, but I'm not aware of any more because it's the space at STS-107 stands for Space Transportation System. And as far as I know, it's the same systems. They have updated systems. In fact, Columbia has been updated and overhauled in the last couple of years. It has what they call the glass cockpit. That's where they read, the pilots read the stuff actually on the windshield in front of them. So it's got the latest navigation equipment on board. It's not the same navigation equipment that was there, for example, 22 years ago when John Young and Robert Crippen took off on April the 12th, 1981. So anyway, it's essentially the same, though, as it was Challenger. It's not that much different.
Any people who've been allowed to peek inside the cockpit, perhaps while boarding a commercial jet, know what Jay's talking about when he mentions a glass cockpit. It has replaced in so many of the more modern commercial aircraft the old dials that were on aircraft cockpits. In many cases, they are duplicated with graphics on a data screen because pilots are so often taught to think in an analog fashion. They can only look down and glance, and a needle should be where it should be. So just as digital speedometers didn't live a very long and prosperous life on cars because people wanted to see relationships, many of the dials and gauges are duplicated, but it is done so as part of a streamlining of the cockpit. This modern cockpit of this space shuttle looks nothing like it did when it first went up. It was much more of a maze of smaller controls than it is now. We're looking now at some video taken in zero-G conditions on board the spacecraft. The Challenger, Columbia, all of them, Discovery, all of them in the flight are not only modes of transportation, they really are home for the days where the astronauts spend en route to, it's been, the space station has been their destination more often than not lately, en route to the space station and home again. Sad to see some of that video, knowing what we know, knowing what we suspect today, and that is the loss of these 7 NASA astronauts. If you're just joining us, we're waiting a press statement from the NASA Administrator, Sean O'Keefe. Jay, tell us about Sean O'Keefe. A lot of Americans were familiar with Dan Golden because of his longtime tenure of NASA.
Well, Sean O'Keefe is what they call, in today's conversation, a bean counter. He came from the side of Washington, D.C., where they keep track of every dollar, and they thought that by bringing Sean O'Keefe in, that he would get NASA's dollar house in order. They had been spending too much money, more money than they had programmed, and they were had a $4 billion deficit, and Sean O'Keefe came in to do that. So far, I would grade Sean as a watcher on the outside, as a journalist. I would grade him with at least a B+. He's been doing a very good job in putting NASA's house in order, and this is, I know, is something that it's going to be terrible for him to have to deal with because he's only been on board, I'm just doing this from memory now, about a year, and so it's going to be a little difficult because Dan Golden had been around for many years, as you said, and now this is Sean O'Keefe's yoke, if you will, to bear, and he'll be dealing with it.
Jay, the journalist William Burroughs, who was with us earlier, said that members of Congress really do bear a responsibility here, that the space program isn't further along than it is now. Who are the champions of space exploration in Washington, and what would it take for Americans to express a desire that, yes, we would like this to go back to being a national priority as it was when John Kennedy vowed to make it to the moon by the end of the decade?
Well, in my humble opinion, the champions of the space program have always been the visionaries. The problem that the space program has always had with Congress is because Congress will penny pinch. And in the loss of the Challenger, it proved that had they given NASA the solid rocket, one-stage solid rocket boosters that they wanted from the beginning, that they would have saved a lot more money because they had to replace Challenger. Not only did they lose 7 lives, they had to spend $2.5 billion to replace Challenger. The engineers wanted from the get-go a single solid rocket motor, which was much more safe than the 3 stages. And that's why they had to go through with the J joint and to build what they did. So they wound up spending a lot more money than they would have spent if they had done it right in the first place. And again, we might see that in this accident. We don't know yet what caused this. But in every case, when you're dealing with electronics and you're dealing with science on the cutting edge, if you try to penny pinch, you will find that you are going to wind up costing a lot more than if you had spent the money you should have spent to begin with. So I go back to answer your question about the people who are the heroes are the visionaries. And you mentioned John F. Kennedy, and I will never forget when the man said, first of all, he brought the experts into his office, and he asked them, what can we do before the Russians can do it? Can they get to the moon before us? And they said, yes, they can get to the moon before us. He says, how about Mars? Can we get to Mars before them? Yes, we can get to Mars before them. So his decision was, should I commit spacecraft to Mars? That our goal is going to be to get to Mars. And he was thinking about trying to do that in 20 years instead of 10 years. But he went back to the Apollo program, back to the moon, and 400,000 people were put to the task of Apollo, and it cost $24 billion and something dollars. That included the Mercury, the Gemini program, and Apollo. And we got there, and we got there before the decade was out. And the only time that we got in trouble, Brian, was when Lyndon Johnson decided for his reelection in 1968 to push for us to get a man on the moon before the election so that that would offset the problems that he was having with the Vietnam War. When he started pushing to do that, then they started cutting corners, and we had the Apollo 1 fire. So then that cost us a year to get over that and get back, and we still made it. But they had to bring people back in here that had the experience rather than giving the contract to inexperienced people, which they did. And they had to slow down, and they had to do it right. So when they came back and they did it right, we had a good success with the moon. Everybody thought that possibly, we'd lose a crew on the moon. Everybody thought that Pete Conrad would be the first man to step on the moon with Apollo 12. It would not be Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They thought that Neil Armstrong and Buzz would have to abort. Well, they almost had to, because they had a computer overload going down that told them 2 or 3 times to abort. But the guy that was writing the computer kept saying, keep going, keep going, keep going. They were okay because he knew it was executive overload on the computer that was giving them an abort. And he was right. So it was people that were right on top of things at the same time it was doing what the heck they were supposed to be doing that got us on the moon and got us back. You had the explosion of the service module oxygen tank on Apollo 13. And, we almost lost the lives of Jim Lovell and his crew, and they had to go around the backside of the moon and come back. And had they not been docked to the lunar module with the lifeboat that saved them. So the only time that you really get into trouble is when you try to cut corners.
Jay Barbary from the Cape, where he, along with us, awaits this statement by the NASA administrator. I've been handed some facts correcting some of what we were saying earlier, and had I done the math, this wouldn't have happened. The shuttle was traveling at 18 Mach when it went down. Last contact, 9 a.m. This morning, local time, 16 minutes prior to the time when it was to touch down. That's moving quickly across the country at an altitude of 39 miles up when it was last heard from. 18 Mach was the speed. And we will be seeing, we've been watching this home video over and over. We will, as more people with home video cameras approach 24-hour cable news networks, over-the-air television networks like this one through our local affiliates out in the Texas area, we will be seeing more and more views and vantage points of this tragedy that apparently has played itself out in the skies over Texas today, with all 7 souls on board Columbia believed lost in this catastrophic failure of the Space Shuttle's 113th manned mission into space, the 144th manned mission into space by the United States. Conditions being what they are in this country, a lot of thoughts when the news was first learned this morning turned to the specter of terrorism. We can report with great confidence at this hour that there is absolutely nothing to that for this to have been terrorism would require a technology not known to exist on the Earth, and that is a satellite to space shuttle shot fired, an ordnance of some type, an ability in the inner reaches of outer space to shoot down a moving spacecraft, and that does not exist, as we have been told many times by the government today. Jim Miklaszewski is our man at the Pentagon all day long today, including the early hours when I'm sure they weren't so sure early on, Mick.
Well, there was some immediate early speculation that perhaps this was some kind of terrorist act, but military officials put that to rest very quickly for a couple of reasons that you raised, Brian. First of all, it was at 200,000 feet. There is no known military weapon in the hands of any country or terrorist organization that could be launched from the Earth to shoot it down, and it's unclear as to exactly what the speed was when the shuttle accident occurred, when the explosion actually occurred. We're told by some of the Air Force experts that as the shuttle begins to descend and break into the atmosphere, there's a period there where it actually slows down significantly. But at any rate, it was going tens of thousands of miles per hour at the time that the explosion occurred. So that would pretty much eliminate any possibility that there would be any kind of earthbound weapon that could do that. And as one official had said, it would have to be a space satellite shooting a weapon, and that kind of thing just doesn't exist. And when you look at the Pentagon and their efforts to intercept and shoot down ICBMs, you know, it's the missile defense system that has undergone testing for many years, and even with the most highly sophisticated weaponry and technology that they have, their success rate isn't all that good. It's very difficult under controlled circumstances. And in addition, one question was raised, could a bomb have been placed aboard the shuttle before it took off? That too pretty much ruled out, considered not a possibility. The security at Cape Canaveral, what had already been increased significantly after September 11th, and from what we understand from NASA officials, that security around this flight was especially high because of the presence of the Israeli astronaut, the Israeli Air Force Colonel Ramon. So any hint, although the conspiracy theorists will certainly crawl out of the woodwork as they do in any kind of event like this, any hint that this was a terrorist act has been dismissed by the officials in the know. There was early on, when people were trying to figure out exactly what happened, we are told that at least one U.S. military spy satellite, an infrared satellite that is designed to scan the Earth's surface to watch for any kind of missile launches in any country, any kind of explosion such as a nuclear test, did in fact detect what they call a heat spike in the vicinity of the Columbia shuttle at about the same time that the explosion occurred. And this satellite not only would have been able to detect any kind of explosion, but would also have been able to accurately track the flight path of the burning Columbia shuttle as it descended to Earth. NASA, of course, has said much of its communications had been knocked out almost immediately, so it may be somewhat difficult for them to have tracked the exact path, but there are satellites in orbit that could certainly have done that, and if not give them a clue as to what happened, at least follow its flight path. Now, in terms of search and rescue, anytime a shuttle takes off from Cape Canaveral or is preparing to land, the U.S. military does have helicopters in the region to take part in any kind of possible search and rescue effort should there be some kind of catastrophic event. As there was in the Challenger during 1986, there were helicopters already in the air. Unfortunately, there was little they could do because it appeared that the astronauts had been killed in the initial blast. But those helicopters were already in the air. In the case of the Columbia shuttle today, there were no military assets in the air in the flight path over North Texas. It just didn't seem well, obviously nobody foresaw this catastrophe occurring, and any kind of search and rescue would have been around the site itself.
Jim,
but since then, the U.S. military...
We got a flight with a few statements about STS-107. We will have no questions today, just a few brief remarks.
As indicated earlier, we'll make a statement today, and then at this point, and a little later this afternoon at about 3 o'clock Eastern Time, there'll be a full technical briefing conducted from the Johnson Space Center. So at this point, we're just going to give you the circumstances as we understand them leading up to this particular tragedy today. This is indeed a tragic day for the NASA family, for the families of the astronauts who flew on STS-107, and likewise tragic for the nation. Immediately upon indication of a loss of communications on STS-107, at a little after 9 a.m. this morning, we began our contingency plan to preserve all the information relative to the flight activities. I immediately advised the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Tom Ridge, at the point after landing was due to have occurred at 9:16. Spoke to them very briefly thereafter to advise that we had lost contact with the Shuttle Orbiter Columbia and STS-107 crew. They offered, the President specifically offered, full and immediate support to determine what the appropriate steps were thereafter to be taken. We then spent the next hour and a half working through the detail and information of what we have received, and Bill Reedy will walk you through the specifics of those operational and technical issues here in just a moment. Thereafter, we have met with the family members of the astronauts who were here at Kennedy Space Center and are soon to be departing back to Johnston, to Houston. The President has called and spoken to them to express our deepest national regrets. We have assured them that we will begin the process immediately to recover their loved ones and understand the cause of this tragedy. At this time, we have no indication that the mishap was caused by anything or anyone on the ground. We've assembled a mishap investigation team that immediately was assembled upon the point of past the stage in which the orbiter was to have landed here at Kennedy Space Center a little after 9:30, and that team in turn is coordinating on a regular basis on all the facts that are pertaining to this from the Johnson Space Center, and a rapid response team from here at the Kennedy Space Center, as well as participants from the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. In addition to these internal efforts, we have also appointed a mishap investigation board, an external group of people who are independent from NASA, who will immediately be charged with the opportunity to look at all the information that was immediately locked down right after our absence of communications. Each of these individuals are safety and mission assurance related officials in other federal departments of the federal government, from the Air Force, from the Navy, from the Department of Transportation, and across the federal expanse. The investigation team will also be chaired by an individual contacted to serve who is external to the federal agencies, and we'll have the opportunity to coordinate all the information again from an external view. So we'll be conducting both the internal activity as well as an external review immediately to ascertain the causes and circumstances under which this tragedy occurred. We pulled together all the federal agencies and local governments as well. In discussion several times this morning with Secretary Tom Ridge, the effort is heavily underway to coordinate an understanding of exactly where the orbiter path had taken it from West Texas towards the Kennedy Space Center here in Florida, and to make sure that the material on the ground is secured so that the investigation can begin promptly. We would urge anyone who believes they have discovered or found any material to stay away from it and to please contact local officials. The local first responder groups for emergency services and so forth have been authorized and directed by Secretary Tom Ridge to assist in all manner. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is coordinating that effort on the part of the Department of Homeland Security. I was here this morning with the families of the astronauts and their friends. It started out as a pretty happy morning, awaiting the landing of STS-107. And we had highly anticipated their return because we couldn't wait to congratulate them for their extraordinary performance and their excellent efforts on the science mission on this very important flight. They dedicated their lives to pushing the scientific challenges for all of us here on Earth. And they dedicated themselves to that objective and did it with a happy heart, willingly, and with great enthusiasm. The loss of this valiant crew is something we will never be able to get over, and certainly the families of all of them, we have assured we will do everything we can possibly do to guarantee that they work their way through this horrific tragedy. We ask the members of the media to honor that too. To please respect their privacy and please understand the tragedy that they are going through at this time. We will help the media assure that be the case as well. We trust that the prayers of the nation will be with them and with their families. And again, a more courageous group of people you could not have hoped to know than the families of these crew members. And an extraordinary, extraordinary group of astronauts who gave their lives and did it in a way that they knew exactly the risk, but never, ever, do we ever want to see a circumstance where something like this could ever happen. And we diligently dedicate ourselves every single day to assuring these things don't occur. And when they do, we have to act responsibly, accountably, and that's exactly what we will do. To give you more of the operational detail of what has occurred here since 9 a.m. this morning, the Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, a former astronaut, retired captain of the United States Navy, former test flight pilot, Bill Reedy, who has commanded 2 separate missions previously and as an astronaut, and is now, again, our Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, and has worked with me all morning along with all of us here at Kennedy Space Center to work through the details of the events as we know them and to present to you the facts that we understand them. Again, the technical details that are being worked very diligently now will be covered again at 3 p.m. this afternoon out of the Johnson Space Center. With that, let me turn it over to Captain Bill Reedy.
It's a truly difficult day for all of us. Many of us were standing alongside the runway waiting to celebrate their triumphant return after a 16-day science mission. I think you could tell from the downlink that they loved what they were doing and they thought what they were doing was extremely important, pushing back those boundaries in science. At 9 o'clock, we heard that they had lost data from the spacecraft, and it appears that that was at about 200,000 feet, about Mach 18. The loss of data was somewhere over north central Texas, and at the planned landing time of 9:16, we initiated our contingency action plan called the Rescue Coordination Center and initiated a search and rescue effort. Sadly, I think from the video that's available, it does not appear that there were any survivors. We have currently impounded all the data, including all the pre-flight certification of flight readiness for STS-107. And at this point, I'd have to say it's too early to speculate about the exact cause. Obviously, we're looking at all the data that we have available. Those people that have videos, those people that have still pictures, we'll urge you to contact NASA so that we can coordinate those things that might be available. And to reiterate what the administrator said, those people that may find debris, do not touch it, do not move it. Contact your local authorities, have them impound it and secure the area so that our technical specialists will be able to piece together the puzzle so that we can resolve what happened. Our immediate focus is on the crew families, and we spent some time with them. The president called. I'd have to say the families are bearing up with an incredible amount of dignity considering their loss. We all grieve for them. We all pray with them for the crew. But one thing came across loud and clear when visiting with them is they knew that the crew was absolutely dedicated to the mission that they were performing. And I think you could see that in the video downlink. They believed in what they were doing. And in the conversations with the crew and their families, they said that we must find what happened and fix it and move on. And we can't let their sacrifice be in vain. Today was a very stark reminder that this is a very risky endeavor, pushing back the frontiers in outer space, and after 113 flights, unfortunately, people have a tendency to look at it as something that is more or less routine. Well, I can assure you it is not. Each and every time I flew, each and every time my colleagues flew, we treated that with the respect that it deserved from a professional standpoint. And I have to say that as the one responsible for shuttle and station within the NASA, that I know that the people of NASA did everything possible preparing for this flight to make it as perfect as possible. My promise to the crew and to the crew families is that the investigation that we have just launched will find the cause, we'll fix it, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Again, we know you all have questions, and we will have a news briefing at 3 o'clock, and we'll give you that opportunity at that time. Thank you.
That will be it. That will be it for now. As you heard from NASA, a very emotional view of this accident from a man who was, as he said, waiting on the runway for this crew, friends and acquaintances of his, co-workers, colleagues, and fellow space travelers to return from their mission on board Shuttle Columbia. We want to go to Jay Barbary, our veteran correspondent covering this part of the world. And Jay, anything stand out from what you heard there?
No, it's pretty much what we expected, Brian. They've got everything into place. All of the studies have started. They'll be looking at everything, including all of the videotape that they can bring together that people shot from the ground. They'll be checking with the Pentagon. They'll be checking with NORAD out at Colorado Springs. They'll be looking at anything that our satellites may have recorded from space itself. They'll be putting all the pieces together and trying to come up with an answer to what happened. And that's pretty much it. There will be a news conference, as they said, at 3 o'clock, assuming they meant 3 o'clock our time, and that will take place in Houston with some of the more technical people there. We may get a little bit more information. However, I doubt it. I think it'll probably be at least 2, 3, 4, 5 days before they'll really have any idea of what happened, Brian.
Jay Barbary, okay, stay with us. We'll be going back to you. The public is involved in more than one way in this as we all begin to deal with what is this apparent tragedy. Number one, you heard the plea to anyone who might have gone outside armed with a video camera. Obviously, the television networks have been playing various views of this catastrophe all day, but more importantly, the civic duty with such videotape is to hand it over, such was the plea here, to NASA. They will be piecing together all available views of the eventual crash of the debris, what was left of this space shuttle, as they get them from citizens. A lot of what we have been playing today is amateur video, people who heard the noise and went outside in Texas to take pictures of it. We have this on the debris shield from the Associated Press. An East Texas sheriff says debris may be floating down for hours. We should quickly note this is a sheriff and not a NASA scientist, and we don't know if this stretches what we know about how long it takes something to fall from an altitude of 39 miles. The Cherokee County Sheriff James Campbell says debris is reported to be falling in a concentrated area between the towns of Jacksonville, Palestine, Rusk, and Athens in East Texas. This report is 20 minutes old. Highly doubt, however, that it'll be falling for a matter of hours. We do know about some of the pieces on the ground. Scott Gordon, a correspondent for NBC television station KXAS, is with us. He's been patiently standing by from where one of the larger pieces has been identified and located. Scott?
Well, Brian, we're here in the town of Rice, Texas, about 45 miles or so southeast of Dallas. We're here on the front lawn of the Rice High School. Let me step out of the way and show you what we've got here. You can see the yellow tape has been set up around everyone here believes, no confirmation, but what everyone here believes is a small piece of the shuttle. You can see that small rectangular object to the right side of that yellow pole. That's it. It's a charred piece, apparently of tile. Apparently a piece of the shuttle that fell to ground here in Rice, Texas this morning. We're getting similar reports of a similar type debris throughout this area. With us now live is State Trooper Dane Baker with the Texas Department of Public Safety. Trooper, what can you tell us about how this was discovered this morning?
It's still unknown as exactly who discovered the item. It was notified to the local sheriff's department, who there informed us to come to the scene and secure the area because it possibly being a hazardous material and make sure nobody touches the item.
Now, this is a relatively small piece of debris. How many similar reports are you getting throughout East Texas here of similar type debris?
We've had several unconfirmed reports throughout the area. A lot of them have been unfounded. Still, we're waiting to get officers and troopers over to those other locations so we can secure the areas and get someone who can officially identify the items.
And we can see a lot of people here. It's becoming a little bit of an attraction here. Are you afraid that people here may be too close? Is there any concern or any danger?
Right now, we just set the perimeter up the best that we can and to advise people to stay clear as best as we can. It's all we can do at this point.
All right, Dane Baker, thank you very much. As Trooper with the Texas Department of Public Safety here. So Brian, that's the situation here in East Texas. One small piece of debris over my shoulder, and there's a lot of other similar type debris all throughout this area that they're finding.
Scott, our thanks to you for that report. Scott Gordon, again, a correspondent with NBC television station KXAS, and a reminder for people who may approach pieces of debris, and it is over an area of several hundred miles, as best we can understand it. The propellants used on the shuttle are toxic, say nothing of the fact that this is all now evidence and should not be touched. Officials are saying don't even go near it if you see it. The Air National Guard is up over a several hundred-mile wide area. They're using some sort of airborne sensors to see if they can find debris lying on the ground. The National Forest Service has a lot of acreage underneath the area identified as the debris field. They will be dispatching employees to go over as much as they can of federal land. So in so many counties and across so many hundred miles right now, there's a huge effort to get people to fan out as long as daylight lasts, at least what's the remainder of Saturday, to find what has come down from the sky. We're going to go back to a gentleman who was so helpful in describing what happened. He was home at the time. Bob Moulter is with us from Palestine, Texas. And Bob, again, tell us what you first saw and first heard.
Okay, Brian, it was approximately 8:09 this morning, and there was a loud, extended noise, like a continuous explosion, and my entire house was shaking. And living close to a railroad tracks on a major line, I thought that perhaps there had been a major derailment or explosion over there, and I walked outside, looked towards the tracks. The ground was still shaking, and the noise was still, rumbling on. And when I looked up above me, there was a very large smoke plume, but it was in a spiral or a swirling type motion headed towards the southeast. And as I watched it, I was looking towards the sun. There was a glow near the front of it. If you've seen, obviously you have, the reports on television, I've come to find out that was a vapor trail, but what was shown on television, if you magnified that 10 or 15 times, that was the width of it when it was over me here in Palestine. It continued on for well over a minute, maybe a minute and a half, before it began to dissipate, the sound, and then I lost sight of it into the sun to the southeast.
Bob, as far as we can tell, everyone who has had a different view of this, and everyone has a different story to tell. Over some portions of Texas, it was still whole, and then later on it broke up into several pieces, and we now know the pieces as small as tiles and even smaller are landing on the ground. But the entire width of the sky, you saw it as one piece?
No, sir, I could not say that it was one piece. It would be hard for me to discern where I was standing how many pieces it was. I can very definitively say it was not one piece.
Okay, and the roar was something like a sonic boom?
It would be like a prolonged sonic boom. I've mentioned to people if they've ever heard a tornado, or someone gave me another analogy. If you were to stand right next to a freight train moving at a very high rate of speed and listen to the entire train go by, that would be the intensity of the sound.
And for how many seconds do you estimate?
I'm estimating between a minute and a minute and a half.
Bob Moulter, thank you very much for joining us once again from Palestine, Texas. We are joined now by former astronaut, shuttle astronaut Richard Houck. And Mr. Houck, thank you for being with us. If memory serves, you flew the first shuttle that went up after the Challenger mission, correct?
Right, Brian. Listening to Mr. Mulder, I can only conclude that what he heard was the reason it was such an extended sonic boom. Many of those parts create their own sonic boom. So whereas if you have one space shuttle passing overhead, you expect to hear a boom boom, very short, staccato-like, but if you've got a lot of pieces there, you've got a conflagration of many pieces, each creating their own sonic boom, so the fact that it was prolonged does not surprise me.
How active have you stayed in the program? And I have the unfortunate task of asking if you knew personally any of the crew members believed lost today.
I did not know any of them personally. I've been close to NASA and have worked with them on several committees over the years, but I left shortly after my last flight and have been in private business since then.
Tell us about the shuttle program. Obviously, the huge setback back in '86 after Challenger, and then we, as we've been discussing all day, we kind of got blasé and complacent about it. People didn't notice the coverage anymore. The average American couldn't tell you if there was a shuttle up at any given time, and here we are, jolted back into paying attention to the space program.
Right. It's hard to believe that there have been over 100 space shuttle missions. Back then, of course, there's some stark contrast between this accident and the Challenger tragedy. Of course, the Challenger occurred right at liftoff. The actual problem did, and because there was so much coverage, NASA coverage, video coverage of that liftoff, they were able to zero in on that problem fairly quickly as being hot gases escaping from the solid rocket booster. Another big difference, of course, is most of the debris fell into the water off of the coast there, and so that in some ways hampered the collection of debris. In some ways, we're fortunate that this happened over the United States. I hope that no one was hurt on the ground, but access to the debris, as long as the public is helpful in bringing it to NASA's attention, that should be very helpful. The question of how much telemetry data was coming down from the space shuttle will be very interesting. I don't know if, in fact, it is typical now for there to be a loss of data during re-entry. It certainly was typical when I was flying, just because of the great plasma sheath of electricity that builds around the shuttle as it comes through the Earth's atmosphere. So that would be a question that would be interesting to ask. Did they have data right up to the time of breakup, or were they in the period of what they call blackout?
So this is a point in landing where it is possible that some screens, some aspects of the intelligence and telemetry they were getting went blank and are accustomed to do so.
As far as I know, as I say, there may be more powerful transmitters and receivers than during the time I was flying, and so that time frame may be less or may not. There may not be a blackout period, but that's a good question to ask.
We've been talking, sir, about the character of the people who were up today, and generally those who are attracted to the space program, and the following may require you to cast modesty aside, but what is different about you and your colleagues, that you made a conscious decision not to pursue a lifetime in the insurance business or law enforcement or anything else, but you took a measurable risk, a 1 in 75 chance of catastrophic failure? Why?
Well, first of all, of course, you believe it cannot happen to me, but everyone that gets into the Space Shuttle program, like many other adventurers, that's the key. You are adventurous. You seek pushing the envelope. When I speak to groups, I'll ask, how many of you are downhill skiers? And if they raise their hands, I say, you'd probably like to be an astronaut. There are a lot of parallels there, the beauty of the Earth, the chances that you take, the thrill, the rush. So these are adventurous people, and clearly to be selected by NASA to fly in the Space Shuttle, they have to have extraordinary talent.
Talk about the esprit de corps. These 7 have been together for so long now. They were said to be, sounded so happy over the downlink, the live coverage, even their conversations on just prior to re-entry today.
Well, it's a time for elation. Here you are, you've just completed a 16-day mission. You've seen the beauty of the Earth. You've contributed to the development of science, of learning how we might spend more time in space, maybe even going on to Mars. And now you've suited up, you're strapped into your seats, and you're coming back home. What a wonderful time. There's very little for the crew to do at that point. The shuttle is controlled automatically. The pilot and the commander are monitoring all the dials and the equipment and ready to take over if there's something that happens that you could cope with. But all you really have to do is look out the window, and passing over the great northwest of the United States, Canada, and coming down over the central United States heartland, I'm sure they were looking out the window at sunrise and just marveling at the view.
Mr. Huck, I want to share with you something just handed to me from Johnson Space Center, Houston, Associated Press. It sounded like routine communication, but now it has taken on a whole new meaning. The communication message was heard shortly before 9 a.m. Eastern. It starts with a mission controller at the Johnson Space Center saying, Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last. A reply comes from an astronaut believed to be Shuttle Commander Rick Husband, who says, Roger. And then here is the crucial part of what we know. The transmission then breaks off after the crew member starts to say a word beginning with the sound buh, and it's spelled here B-U-H. And I guess anything at this point, Mr. Houck, would be pure speculation.
Pure speculation. Of course, the tire pressure, that refers to the landing gear that is nestled. I have a model here.
As do we, yeah.
Okay, well, the tires are nestled right up here into the bottom of the space shuttle, and the tire pressures are continuously monitored because it could cause a problem if the tires were flat upon landing. To speculate on why the tire pressures would change, the only thing that I can think of is if there was increased heating back in that area.
We were having a conversation earlier with Buzz Aldrin and expressing the very American hope that they didn't know this was coming, that no one felt anything, these 7 souls on board. He feared the opposite was true, that maybe they had some prior indication that something had gone wrong, as we now believe the Challenger astronauts do. It's delving into the unthinkable.
Yes, it is. Well, it didn't last long, obviously a matter of minutes, but it's terrible to think of, but it's life.
And back up to your explanation of why people say it sounded like a sustained noise of a freight train going by. When you're doing Mach 18, it also, by extension, means that all the parts of your spacecraft that may separate are also doing Mach 18, correct?
Absolutely, and depending upon how massive they are, they will be slowed down in the atmosphere at different speeds. For example, the main engines are very massive, and they would travel a lot farther downrange before they broke up than, say, the tiles. There are 20,000 of those little 8 by 8 inch tiles on the bottom of the space shuttle. I think we saw a picture of one down near Rice, Texas High School. I'm quite sure that's what it was. As far as speculation of debris coming down minutes or hours afterwards, I can perceive of flight documentation, papers or whatever, if it's caught up in the jet stream. Of course, this breakup occurred above the jet stream, and that is masses of wind moving over 100 miles an hour. Paper could be carried hundreds of miles.
As we look at this, have you been at all critical of modernization, the pace of change at NASA, whether or not this still makes sense given where science is, where flight technology is, as the best vehicle to be doing this?
No, I have not been critical. The space shuttle is an incredible vehicle. It requires a tremendous amount of maintenance and oversight, and NASA, I believe, is giving the proper oversight and maintenance to it. Of course, there's discussion now as to the next generation space shuttle. Should we develop one? And I believe that's Mr. O'Keefe, the administrator of NASA, has started an initiative there. But I have never had the sense that there's been a disregard of safety issues as it relates to the space shuttle.
Richard Houck, who we should remind our audience is the brave man that Jay Barbary was talking about earlier, who piloted the shuttle flight that went up after the catastrophic loss of the Challenger. Mr. Houck, you're very kind to join us from Washington today.
Thank you, Brian.
Here in New York, I am joined, as we have been all day, by NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell, who has covered, of course, the space program for many years for us. And Bob, you know, we know what we know at this point. The evidence is very limited. We're limited to these wire service dispatches. We'll know a whole lot more at 3 o'clock when the press conference happens. But what is the early list of possible went wrongs here?
Well, the early list is that something went wrong with the tiles that caused when Mr. Houck was talking about the enormous heat that creates a plasma around the space shuttle as it's on re-entry. It's thousands of degrees. If there was a break in the integrity of those tiles, everyone has known all along that that could cause a space ship to break up into many pieces. There's rocket fuel on board that could cause an explosion. It was certainly something of a sudden event. So those would be my contenders for entirely on speculation. From a political standpoint, Brian, it's very interesting that Administrator O'Keefe noticed today that he had set up 2 organizations immediately to investigate this. One was a team from NASA that began its work, he said, at 9:30, which was less than 15 minutes after the shuttle had been scheduled to land in Florida. And they began their work immediately. He talked about locking down the data to make sure that nothing is inadvertently thrown out, no computer disks are inadvertently erased, that every piece of information is preserved. The information also includes everything that had to do with preparing the Columbia for launch. Don't forget that we've seen numerous times when shuttle launches are scrubbed at the last minute because things don't check out. There's checks and rechecks of all kinds of systems, and after the 1986 Challenger explosion, there was a lot of allegations that NASA had been rushing things and that the checks weren't performed as well as they had been, and there was decisions were made to go ahead on a very cold morning that led to that problem. The other thing that NASA Administrator O'Keefe said is that he's setting up an outside board. The other thing, one of the other legacies of 1987 was that NASA did a very at first, very shoddy job of trying to investigate itself, and as we probably remember, a Blue Ribbon Commission was set up in Washington. So right away today they're saying that NASA is not only setting up its own internal investigation, it's setting up a board of experts who are not associated with NASA to be looking at it from the outside, I think to avoid this criticism and to show that right from the very moment of this, every piece of crucial information is going to be analyzed so that the NASA officials and the rest of the country can be satisfied that they understand exactly what happened and how to fix it.
Bob Bazell with us here in our studios in New York. Bob, thank you for that, and we are duty-bound to pass along that the public does play a role in this. Any and all home videotape shot of this from any angle is now wanted badly by NASA and would be considered evidence in this investigation, because no two angles of this tragedy are the same. And they may indeed show crucial information from different vantage points across what we now know to be hundreds of miles of this country. And of course, Rick Houck just pointed out that this was above the jet stream, so that debris may be carried along quite a good distance before it is then allowed to drop from the sky. Obviously, the larger pieces would come right down. It is a few minutes before the hour of 2 o'clock Eastern, and we have just learned we will hear from the president in the cabinet room in 3 to 4 minutes time here. NBC News White House correspondent David Gregory has been on standby all day long for us. David, evidently they came back to the White House and got right to work on a statement for the nation.
They did. They came back in a hurry after what we have now heard was a pretty busy morning for this president, who was called by the administrator of NASA just after communications were lost with Columbia. Tom Ridge, who is, of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security, also received a phone call. The president, Mr. O'Keefe said, promised full support, all the resources that were necessary. Tom Ridge then implemented that order by putting into motion a series of steps that were taken both locally and on a federal level. The president has been in communication with family members, too. We learned from Mr. O'Keefe, those family members who were gathered in Florida waiting for their loved ones to return from this important and dangerous mission, a mission that has turned to disaster, as we have heard NASA officials explain it. This is a moment for the president, as he has done in other moments like this, to reflect the grief of the country, to talk about the heroism and the danger that these astronauts face, and to pay tribute to them. His senior staff has been in place for hours here at the White House, talking to one another and communicating with the president as well. And we know, Brian, in moments like this, that there are some key players. Michael Gerson, who is, of course, the chief speechwriter for the president, Karen Hughes, an outside advisor who often plays a role, Dan Bartlett, the communications advisor, and others, including the national security team that has been in place for some time here to advise the president and help him craft a message, as is the duty of a president in such a time of grief like this. We recall back in 1986 when President Reagan spoke so eloquently in the aftermath of the Challenger disaster. Now this president faced with a similar task. It's also worth noting, Brian, as we await the president in the cabinet room, that administration officials have been saying for hours now that there is no indication that this is anything but an accident. While an investigation is still in the beginning phases as to what went wrong here, those certainly around them asking questions about whether terrorism could play a role. Officials making very clear that they have no evidence to point them in that direction.
And
Brian.
David, as you're speaking, let's see if we can't take a shot of Mission Control, which I've just noticed switching around here in the studio is a very, very somber sight. They're all standing, either listening to something we can't see off camera, like an address from a colleague or boss, or they are standing awaiting, as we are, the president's live address from the cabinet room. But a somber and extraordinary sight there. All of these people who were so hard at work and happy after a successful mission are now engaging in something else entirely. We're standing by to take the feed live of the president from the cabinet room at the White House. And David, we don't know much about when this is coming up. We normally get a 2-minute warning from the White House. It's now officially 2 p.m. and 15 seconds. So, David, I know this, as you mentioned, was fairly hastily arranged.
It was, and it's been pulled together really in the last couple of hours. We heard early on from administration officials that the president would, of course, speak to the nation, but they wanted here to make sure that NASA would speak first. That has happened. We know in that interim period that language was being drafted, all of the measures taken to put this kind of thing into motion to be able to broadcast it live. That has happened, and so we will await final word, as this president has to again address the country at a time of such grief that he last faced in the aftermath, of course, of September 11th, when he, of course, was in Florida and addressed the country from various places around the country in a time of grief. This is, as I think it bears repeating, not a national emergency that continues to develop, but a national tragedy that continues to unfold. That's the guidance that we have gotten repeatedly from White House officials, and so the President will reflect on a mission that, as you pointed out, was not something that Americans were thinking a great deal about, but those people in that room were thinking about it minute by minute, and the loved ones of the family members, those 7 astronauts on board who were gathered to greet their loved ones from an important mission, a dangerous mission, something that is still on the outer limits of adventure in this country. This is now the time for the President to reflect on that as these Americans have been lost.
The President is indeed there. They are getting ready to give him the cue to go, but he is standing by in the Cabinet Room. Among our other satellite sources here in New York, also available to us, is Channel 2 News in Tel Aviv, a local newscast in that city where it's the night of the Sabbath now, going on late evening, and they have suffered a terrible loss. This decorated national hero, Israeli fighter pilot, Ilan Ramon, who went down as one of the 7 today, a huge national tragedy in the nation of Israel, a nation which does not usually even divulge the names and identities of its fighter pilots lest they get shot down in the hostile territory that surrounds them. But in this case, they have made quite a national celebration out of his presence on this mission. At Mission Control, they remain standing. We all remain in a waiting position for the President, who was just seen very, very briefly as cameras began to focus in on him. They are making some lighting and microphone adjustments in the Cabinet Room. All of us waiting for him to speak are in the same boat. We will put it right on the air the minute the White House patches the address through to us.
Brian, I might also mention, we often think about the Vice President in situations like this as well. Dick Cheney, not in Washington. He was actually hunting today in Texas, nowhere near the site of the explosion, and he is not returning to Washington. He's obviously in a secure place as the President continued to monitor events here.
It is one of these rare days where Americans, David, are huddled around television sets. You can count them on the fingers of one hand in the last 10 years. Some of them have involved personalities. Some of them, as we now know, of course, national tragedies. This was feared to involve a lot more than just a catastrophic spacecraft failure, but thankfully for the nation, it is only that. We say that, of course, but now falls such great grief to these families and to this President, David, and we talked about this earlier, the task once again of being a mourner in chief, and here is President Bush.
My fellow Americans, this day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our Space Shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. On board was a crew of 7. Colonel Rick Husband, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown, Commander William McCool, Dr. Kulpna Shavla, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity. In an age when space flight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket and the difficulties of navigating the fierce outer atmosphere of the Earth. These astronauts knew the dangers, and they faced them willingly, knowing they had a high and noble purpose in life. Because of their courage and daring and idealism, we will miss them all the more. All Americans today are thinking as well of the families of these men and women who have been given this sudden shock and grief. You're not alone. our entire nation grieves with you. And those you loved will always have the respect and gratitude of this country. The cause in which they died will continue. Mankind is led into the darkness beyond our world by the inspiration of discovery and the longing to understand. Our journey into space will go on. In the skies today, we saw destruction and tragedy. Yet farther than we can see, there is comfort and hope. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. The same Creator who names the stars also knows the names of the 7 souls we mourn today. The crew of the Shuttle Columbia did not return safely to Earth, yet we can pray that all are safely home. May God bless the grieving families, and may God continue to bless America.
The president appearing to go back to the podium after his live address from the cabinet room, and one would presume perhaps he is taping another set of remarks for another audience, perhaps even for a broadcast on Israeli television tonight. The president saying the mission will go on. He invoked religion and a higher power, as Ronald Reagan did with such effectiveness after the loss of the Challenger astronauts in his famous slip the surly bonds of Earth speech at that time, when the nation was in grief over the loss of 7 astronauts, as it is today. They were all extraordinary people of extraordinary accomplishment. Many of them officers in the U.S. Armed Forces, many of them pilots. We have for you now a look at all of those believed lost on this mission today. Many of them were veterans of previous space flights, and for whom this travel was a lifelong dream. And their families who had assembled, some of them in a VIP bus at the end of the runway today, had to be quarantined. They've been together with each other since the first word came at 9:16 when the phone first rang at Camp David, where the president had gotten up this Saturday morning, that something had gone wrong. We have heard from the parents of one of them. David Brown was a lot of things in life, including an acrobat. He at one time was a varsity performer in college and performed in circus shows, but went on to be an aerial acrobat in aircraft like the F-18, T-38, and the A-6. He was a captain in the U.S. Navy, age 46, a mission specialist, and we have heard from his parents. Dorothy and Paul Brown today spoke from their suburban Washington home.
This astronaut program is difficult to get into, and we were proud that he achieved that.
Were you afraid for him?
People ask me that often, and I said, this is what Dave wanted to do, and to not be able to go into space would have been the greatest disappointment for him. I'm sure I had my fears, but it's what he wanted to do. And of course we could never envision that this would happen this way.
Dave said he would like to go to Mars, and all the astronauts Dave said he would like to go to Mars. All the astronauts seem to say that. They know it's not technically feasible right now, but that was in the back of his mind as a possible goal.
And as that shuttle was thundering off that launch pad,
my heart was in my throat. My heart was in. I said to Dave the very last time I saw him, I said, Dave, I'll be thinking about you every minute when he just gave me a big kiss on the cheek. And it was still ironic that this has happened.
The landing this morning, did you?
Well, at first we didn't totally understand that. They just said they'd lost contact with the shuttle. We just thought, oh, it was a little communication problem or something. And as it progressed, we became aware that something was very wrong. And then the friends who were at the landing called to kind of give us some warning. This was very serious.
What was, describe that phone call if you could?
Well, one of Dave's friends was Aunt Miklos. She works on the shuttle. When a shuttle comes back in, she repairs the tiles for her crew, would do that. She was the one who called Ann did to say this, just to warn me. This looks, I said, Ann, what does this mean? And she said, this looks very serious. And then I knew that this was not just a small little problem. And then you're just shocked. It's disbelief, you see.
How does your son want to be remembered?
Well,
the mother of mission specialist David M. Brown, you'll be hearing throughout as we learn and get to know who these 7 astronauts were, that they are all extraordinary people. It's how they got to where they were today when this extraordinary accident took place. He was a 4-year collegiate varsity gymnast. He at one time performed in the circus kingdom as an acrobat, a 7-foot unicyclist, and a stilt walker. He went on to get a PhD in medicine, became a flight surgeon, was the first flight surgeon in 10 years in the U.S. military chosen for pilot training while serving on board the carrier Vincent. He became an accomplished pilot in the U.S. Navy, and at an age of 46, reached the apex of his career as a physician, as a pilot, in being chosen for this crew on board Columbia. And again, the common denominator, as we learn more and more about the biographies of all these 7 souls lost today, will be that they were all, in their own way and accomplishments, extraordinary individuals. We've remained in touch with Richard Houck, who was the shuttle pilot for the mission immediately following Challenger. Mr. Houck, would you concur that all along the line, the more we learn, the more we're going to be astounded that they were able to fit so much into one lifetime, each of them?
Well, that's just the type A personality, I guess. One thing I did notice just from my own personal experience within NASA, they want people that have multi-talents and multi-interests. You'll find that pilots do technical work. Technical people help monitor as flight engineers. So you need people that are able to extract their inherent knowledge and apply it in many different ways. That's the essence of a good team member when you're cooped up there in space for long periods of time.
Is it just because there is a practical need to multitask and do the jobs of others once you're up there, so you might as well have multiple skills coming in?
I think that's the heart of it.
And also it makes, one would presume, it would make you a better rounded person?
Well, I think you'll find most people are already pretty well-rounded, but I'll tell you, being an astronaut increases the diameter of that sphere a whole lot.
And for everyone lost today, we have loved ones like these. You could hear the phone ringing in the background. You could hear people gathering in the home, and what sadness that's going to be multiplied times 7 and then exponentially from there.
Oh, it's so sad. Listening to Mrs. Brown talk about her son David, and she said she knew that he died doing what he wanted to do, and you can't. I would say if I died doing what I wanted to do, don't feel too sorry for me. You feel sorry for the extended family.
And don't you think we're going to hear that was said to loved ones on and on throughout these various lives?
Absolutely. As has been said, people know what the risks are, and those that flew in the military as test pilots, it would take more than my 2 hands to count the number of my friends who were killed in the aviation environment. I was a Navy carrier pilot and test pilot, and you never get used to it, but it happens.
I want to bring a colleague of yours in here, Buzz Aldrin, second
Hi,
American on the moon. He's with us from our LA bureau. He's been listening into our conversation. And Buzz, you're one of them. You were constantly pushing the edge of the envelope and testing and willing to go on the next mission. And what is it about your DNA, about the DNA of these 7 lost today?
I think we all somehow have inbred in us the spirit of exploration. Rick, it's nice to hear your words. I know you carried out a wonderful mission after the Challenger accident.
Thank you, Buzz.
We all deeply regret days like this when we have to face such a tragedy. I happen to just be reviewing some email on my computer here in Burbank, NBC studios, and I just received a very moving message. Would you like for me
Sure.
to read
ahead,
just
Buzz.
a few lines? This is a quote from Jordan Care, K-A-R-E, entitled "Fire in the Sky." Yet a nation watched her falling. Yet a world could only cry as they passed from us to glory, riding fire in the sky.
It's a tough day, again, in this country, Buzz, to see another loss. It's been since 1986, and yet the memories of the Challenger disaster seem very fresh. Rick Houck, if we could give Buzz a break here, what is it like to be in this small, finite community of people who've done this for a living?
Well, you know, you're worried, and it's not just the astronauts, of course. It's all the people that support you in, whether it's Kennedy Space Center or Johnson Space Center. They're all professionals. They're not there for the money. They're there because they have a dream and they are dedicated to it, and they are very good at what they do. So when I would go to work in the morning, I would think, here's another opportunity, one more day to be amongst extraordinary people.
And those who can't go up with you, those who seal you in, those who design the spacesuit, the capsule, all the contractors who will never meet you but whose hopes and dreams are riding with you. Go ahead, Buzz.
A few minutes ago.
Yeah, it's all a big team, and one of the proudest moments an astronaut has, I think, is when we have the opportunity to present what's called a Snoopy Award to one of that team on the ground, where we thank them personally for the extraordinary efforts they went through. They're nominated by their colleagues, and it's a wonderful experience.
Rick Houck and Buzz Aldrin, will be back to both of you, I'm sure, as our coverage continues. We want to reintroduce a gentleman who helped us with our coverage early on here today. He's a journalist and an author of so many different books, all of them with a common theme, aviation and space travel and history, and he has flown many an aircraft himself. William Burroughs is with us here in our New York studios, and I'm wondering how familiar you find what you just heard from 2 veterans.
Well, I find it very familiar, actually, Brian. I've got a thought, though. Talking about athletics and how well-rounded these individuals are, Buzz was himself, ironically, a pole vaulter when he was at West Point. And pole vaulting, of course, and astronautics are pretty close in certain fundamental ways. So, yeah, they're very well-rounded people and wonderful people. They truly are.
What will this do to the collective psyche, if anything at all, do you think?
Well, I think we're going to have to get beyond it. It's time to just move on, as I think I said before. The space program isn't going to stop, and given the fact that it isn't going to stop, given the fact that we're going to keep on going out there, we'll pick up the pieces and continue. The problem is they're down one orbiter, one shuttle. And that is a severe blow to the station and to the program as a whole. So I do think they ought to get on with improving the design and succeeding it.
So is what you're saying, use this as a stepping on point to go ahead to the next generation of orbiter, and if there's nothing in the pipeline that they can point to, how long could that take?
Well, it could take quite a while, but on the other hand, as I say, we are down 25% of our orbiting capability. That is obviously really, really serious. It's time to make a decision now, I think, as to whether we're going to stay like this in this precarious situation or put enough funds, and I'm glad to hear the president saying he's behind this, to put enough funding into the program so that we can do the next generation and get on with it.
Do you think it takes selling a new generation of Americans, those of us who were alive and aware of the moon landing, saw such an extraordinary event, but the notion of discovery by space is kind of a foreign notion to a lot of the kids coming up now?
That's absolutely true. NASA got what it wanted, which is to say, to get it taken for granted that it was operating almost like an airline. The problem, of course, is that airlines occasionally have accidents, and that is what happened this morning. But you're quite right. A lot of Americans are complacent. A lot of Americans believe that we have more urgent priorities. I personally believe that the space program is part of what ought to be a comprehensive planetary defense program, the single focus goal of NASA. And part of planetary defense is to get people off the planet, to spread out the species so that if something really awful happens, we will survive. There is nothing more important than that. And therefore, we just better realize it, wake up to it, and move on.
Even as preoccupied as we are with what has also arrived by air on our shores and the threat we're told we now face every day.
Yeah.
Or has it only become more important?
It's become more important. We face multiple threats. And space, for the first time, gives us the capability to defend ourselves. The joke in the space community is that if the dinosaurs had a space program, they'd still be here. So I think on that basis, we've got to get on with it.
If you were counseling President Bush, if you were Karl Rove in the West Wing, would you say, use this, if you have to even, to be even cynical about it? Use it as a vehicle to guide the nation, to cheer the nation on for presidential leadership. It worked for Kennedy. Johnson was its great champion as well. We can do it again.
That's absolutely what I would tell him. As I say, there's nothing more imperative. The point is, it's coming down to decision time. We are severely crippled now. As was pointed out, there are people on the space station who, ironically, may have to get resupplied by a Soyuz. It's just a very bad situation, and I would counsel the president that he could really establish a mark in history by getting with it.
Interesting to hear Captain Brown's dad say he had always talked about going to Mars as the next frontier. Is that universally accepted? Are we going to hear that from the loved ones of a lot of these astronauts who were lost today, that they talked about Mars as the next one?
No, Mars is effectively out of reach in terms of a manned program.
How so?
It's too far away. It's too costly, and the better place to go is back to the moon. You go back to the moon, it's 4 days. And if anything happens, and start a settlement there. If anything serious happens to Earth, you've got a rescue capability. Furthermore, you can use moon shots for practice. Mars is not in the cards for a manned program for a very long time. And again, a lot of us who believe in planetary protection say moon is the place to go.
Let's use that hideous Washington phrase, means testing. What am I, if I'm the president, going to get out of a settlement on the moon? What's the case?
The case is you are going to protect your species. The case is you are going to spread out. Buzz and another author wrote a book years ago called Mission to Tiber. And he's got one character as saying, no place in space is safe forever. Spread out or die. And so I think really, truly, that's what we need to do. And that is a wonderful thing for any president to be behind.
Mr. Burrows, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been good having you to talk to as part of our coverage. This is a very, very sad Saturday, Sabbath evening in Israel, where one of their very best, they are learning, has apparently died today in the skies over Texas in the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. Ilan Ramon was a highly and heavily decorated military veteran, a fighter pilot in Israel, a national hero, the stuff of children's textbooks in school. And he was the first and only Israeli to travel on board an American space shuttle. NBC News correspondent Tom Aspel in our Tel Aviv bureau with this sad day there in Israel. Tom, good evening to you once again.
Hi, Brian. Well, a national tragedy here in Israel. As you say, he was Israel's first astronaut. He was a hero, seen as the best of the best. And over the last 2 years, since he's been training for this mission in the United States, Israeli schools, universities, websites, all dedicated to his training, giving us details of his career, what missions he would carry out during the space shuttle flight. And tonight, his father was in a television studio, all prepared to comment on the live landing and talking to one of the anchors in the studio when the news came through that the shuttle was missing. And he was taken immediately away from the studio in a car. They called an ambulance for him. He elected to travel by car, seemed to be in a bit of a state of shock. And as is the rest of the country here. The news came through just after sunset as it was getting dark at the end of the Sabbath here, and you could see on the motorways people suddenly talking on cell phones, cars flashing their headlights, and immediately television spreading the news here that one of its favorite sons, a man that Israel over the past few months has carefully cultivated to be one of its national heroes here. A tremendous amount of interest in the space flight itself. He was a payload specialist on board Columbia, charged with multitasks on board the mission, but he was also looking after a special Israeli experiment there. They were studying atmospheric dust to give them a better understanding of weather patterns around Israel, and particularly the dust storms which come out of the desert and periodically cover this country in a yellow haze. They had 4 special cameras on board the shuttle, and he was overseeing that experiment, which most Israelis were looking forward to the results of that with some interest. Now, he does have close members of his family here, although his wife and 4 children are in the United States and in what's known as a NASA lockdown at the moment with the other families. Here in Israel, the government is going to great efforts to round up extended members of his family, and later tonight a special flight will take them direct from Israel to the United States. He is an extraordinary man, not only a fighter pilot, but seen by many Israelis to be a bright ray of hope in these difficult times. Everybody looking forward to some good news, to welcoming a new Israeli hero after the last 2 years of violence, particularly in the last few months here during the winter when there's a sense of despair in the country. This was the one bright hope for Israel. Brian?
Tom Aspel in our Tel Aviv bureau, again on this sad Sabbath night there in Israel. Coming up on 2:30 Eastern Time here in our studios in New York, in what is a very sad day across this country. Americans woke up, some of them fearing the very worst, seeing early scratchy television pictures of something hurtling across the sky in Texas. We then learned that the Shuttle Columbia, just 16 minutes before it was to touch down at an altitude of 200,000 feet, about 38 miles above the Earth, at a speed of 18 Mach, 18 times what the speed of sound would be at that altitude, suddenly suffered what is apparently a catastrophic failure. These are the pictures that first came in. Now we're learning more about what fell from the sky. This is the very latest picture we have of debris that came out of this accident. And people, as you see, staying back. Police have roped it off. The public plays 2 roles in what has happened to all of us today. Number one, people in the Central Texas area believed to have gotten home video pictures of what they saw streaking across the sky have been asked to share those pictures with NASA so they can use all the different views, all the different vantage points to piece together the story of just what happened here. Number two, people are warned in that part of the country over a stretch of several hundred miles that they may come across a piece of debris, those people not actually actively looking for it already. And if they should, because of the toxic propellants used by the space shuttle, they should keep a safe and healthy distance. There again, another piece of debris. In some cases, it's being secured by National Guard troops. The Air National Guard is up aloft in the skies over the airspace over several states. If you've seen one, you should know what they're doing up there. They are looking using sensors to find pieces of the wreckage, and the National Forest Service is going over land operated by them to see if they can't find any more of these pieces. They could be the size of one of the ceramic tiles or much smaller. And sadly, This being a grisly business and a sad day in this country, we've had confirmed reports of human body parts found in various parts of Texas. As we said, the phone rang at Camp David at 9:16 a.m. The president hustled back to the White House. The weather had closed in. He had to motorcade and not helicopter. The families were put in a VIP van. They've been sequestered by NASA. They were going to be waiting at the end of the airstrip when the enormous space shuttle finally came to a rest at the end of the several-mile-long landing strip. That was not to be. This crew of 7 highly accomplished, highly skilled astronauts, as we mentioned, the first Israeli ever, some of them veterans of 2 other shuttle flights. This crew of 7 souls, now believed all lost, as we take a look at the various individuals. In the sad days to come for this country, as we are forced to watch another round of the familiar funeral services for all those of us who lived through the Challenger disaster, January 28th of 1986. In these sad days to come, we will learn much more about these brave and accomplished individuals. They truly are America's best, just as the original Mercury 7 astronauts were in their time. These are America's best updated. Space program and society being what it is, a 40-year-old mother of 1, a 48-year-old married father of 4 from Israel, serving together in outer space on what was described as a successful and happy scientific mission until something went terribly wrong a few minutes after 9 a.m. this morning.